Have you ever wondered if the faith you carry today is truly yours, or if it was molded for you to accept without question? What if I told you that behind the story you've been told, there lies a forbidden truth, carefully hidden for centuries, about black spirituality, an ancient, profound truth that has been systematically silenced, erased from books, distorted in pulpits, and buried under layers of fear, guilt, and domination. But now, it's beginning to emerge. And perhaps you're here precisely because this truth calls to you. You were led down paths that taught you to distrust your own roots. They said that anything that came from Africa was pagan, that anything that didn't fit into institutional religion was evil. But they didn't tell you that long before colonization, there existed a living, powerful faith connected to the land, the cycles of life, the universe, and the Creator. A black spirituality that not only survived, but shaped entire civilizations. A spirituality that pulsates to this day, in the songs, in the bodies, in the sacred practices that endured even under persecution. And why did they hide this from you? Who benefits from forgetting your spiritual identity? Who benefits when you don't know where you came from? When you believe there is only one path, one truth, one way to connect with God, the one that takes you away from who you truly are. Today, you will have the opportunity to open your eyes, to hear what was silenced, to remember what was erased. This video is not just a historical exposition, it is a spiritual call, a rediscovery of the essence of the faith that was born before empires, before the Crusades, before the translations of the Bible. A faith that has color, rhythm, voice, and memory. A faith that is returning because it never ceased to exist. It was simply hidden. And throughout this video, you will understand why this truth was forbidden. You will discover the names, places, texts, and practices that were denied to you. You will see the direct connection between the Bible and the African people. You will see how this spirituality was manipulated, demonized, and then reused by the same structure that tried to destroy it. You will learn why black people were associated with evil and how this has affected your spiritual identity to this day. You will discover that the faith of your ancestors was not superstition, it was wisdom, and it is alive, it is waiting for you. But stay with me until the end. Because this video goes beyond the surface. We will traverse centuries of concealment and walk together to the origin, to the dark spiritual matrix that still pulses within you, even if muffled. And if what I've said so far has affected you in any way, write here in the comments, "I want the complete truth." This comment is more than engagement. It's a commitment. If this topic has touched you so far, if something inside you seems to be awakening or questioning everything you've learned, then write in the comments, "I want the whole truth." Yes, comment now. This isn't just a technical request from YouTube. It's a spiritual commitment you're making to your awakening. Plus, when you comment, you help this content reach more people who are also seeking the truth, and who may be stuck in the same silence you've been in for so long. I read every comment, and your words help build a conscious, strong, and connected community. So leave your voice below, and of course, leave a like. This shows YouTube that this content is valuable and worth sharing. It's not just a video, it's a mission. Clicking like is a simple way of saying, this truth needs to be heard. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Here, every week, we delve deep into the hidden mysteries of the Bible, the roots of black spirituality, and truths that have been censored for centuries. Also, turn on the notification bell, because the next videos will take you even further on this journey of revelation and spiritual reconnection. Now that you know how important this content is, let's continue our investigation. Let's go back to the beginning, to the African spiritual cradle, the root that they tried to erase, but that never died. Have you ever stopped to think that long before any formalized religious structure, even before Europe imposed its dogmas and institutions, Black spirituality already existed, pulsed, and was alive, deep, and directly connected with the sacred. Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, it is also the cradle of original spirituality. The first civilizations to record a connection with the divine were born there. And we're not talking about simple or folkloric beliefs as many try to label them. We're talking about highly complex, organized spiritual systems with philosophy, ethics, symbols, rituals, and worldviews that influenced later religions, including those that dominate the world today. Let's start with ancient Egypt, or as it was called in the Egyptian language itself, Kemet, the Black Land. Not because of the color of the soil, as some scholars have tried to claim, but because of the identity of the people themselves, black. The ancient Egyptians had an extremely sophisticated spiritual system centered on the idea of Maat, which represented truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. It was a spirituality that did not separate man from nature nor body from soul. It was integrated, complete, pure. Now stop for a moment and think, does this remind you of anything? The idea of balance, divine justice, and the judgment of the soul after death. All of this was already present thousands of years before the emergence of the Abrahamic religions. Long before Moses ascended Mount Sinai, the priests of Kemet spoke of purity of heart, the weight of sin, and the need to live in harmony with the universe. And why was this hidden? Why did they teach you that it all began there in the desert with a chosen people, and ignore the fact that before that, Ethiopia was already a recognized spiritual center and mentioned several times in the Bible itself? Ethiopia, referred to as Cush in scripture, appears at crucial moments. The prophet Zephaniah mentions Cush. Moses married an Ethiopian woman. And later in the New Testament we see the episode of the Ethiopian eunuch, a black man, minister to Queen Candace, reading the scriptures and being baptized by Philip. A black man, he had access to sacred texts before many other peoples considered religious at the time. Was it a coincidence, or was this already a sign of the presence and importance of black spirituality in divine plans? Let's go further. The Bantu tribes, the Yoruba, the Akan, the Zulu, the Fon, the Ashanti, they all possessed rich, profound spiritual systems connected to the elements of nature and the spirit world. They held ancient knowledge about the afterlife, reincarnation, spiritual balance, purification rituals, ancestry, and a direct connection with the creative force. And you know what's most powerful? These beliefs excluded no one. There was no priestly caste that held all knowledge and hid it from the masses. Black spirituality was lived in everyday life, in dances, songs, offerings, in the cycles of nature, in relationships with ancestors. There was no separation between the sacred and the everyday. Life was sacred, but all of that was being erased. First, through colonization, then through slavery, then through forced catechization. And finally, by the rewriting of history, a rewriting where the white European became the guardian of the faith and the black man, the pagan, the soulless, the barbarian. Now listen carefully. This was no accident. Erasing the original black religion was a strategy of control and domination. Whoever dominates the sacred dominates minds. And if you make a people believe that their spiritual culture is demonic, that their rituals are witchcraft, that their gods are false, you make them dependent on the imposed religion. You make them submissive. And here comes a critical point. Many of the symbols, festivals, and doctrines that you see in modern religions are, in fact, resignifications of African elements. Prayers, fasting, ritual baths, the worship of saints, the importance of music and drums, respect for ancestors. All of this has roots in ancestral black practices, but it was wrapped in another package, given a new name, attributed to other cultures. And the original source was silenced. And the most impressive thing, much of this is in the Bible itself, but no one talks about it. For example, Ethiopia will stretch out her hands to God. Psalm 68:31. This verse, which many pastors read without attention, is an ancient cry. It is a spiritual affirmation that black people have a direct role in the divine plan, that their faith is not borrowed nor secondary. It is legitimate, it is authentic, it is sacred. Another hidden detail, the three wise men who visited Jesus. One of them was black, Belshazzar, and the gold he brought as a gift came from Africa. Jesus was taken to Egypt, a black land, to protect himself from Herod. The Messiah was protected by an African people. Have you ever stopped to think about that? These details matter because when you start to ask yourself why this information is hidden, you begin to understand how faith has been manipulated, not to liberate, but to control. And that's why this video exists, to open your eyes, to question what was taught in a shallow, incomplete, colonized way, to reconnect you with what is rightfully yours, a black, ancestral, legitimate, vibrant, and above all, divine spirituality. If you're here, still watching, it's because something inside you recognizes this. Even if you don't have the right words, even if fear or guilt still try to stop you, your spirit is sensing that this truth has something to do with you. And I invite you to continue with me on this journey. Because in the next few minutes, we'll reveal how this black faith endured, even under chains, lashes, persecution, and fires. Let's discover how she survived disguised as a saint, hidden in corners, camouflaged at parties, but always present, like a flame that never goes out. And I want to know, have you ever heard of the importance of Ethiopia, Kush and Kemet in spirituality? Did you ever suspect that there was something much deeper behind what you were taught? If so, comment here. Africa is the root, or else the black spirit resists. And here is where truth begins to take the form of liberation, the black spiritual matrix. When we speak of occult black religion, we are not talking about an isolated or exotic practice. We are talking about an ancient faith system that is born of the earth, expresses itself through the body, pulses in the hearts of the people, and echoes in the songs of the ancestors. Unlike Western religious structures that were organized within dogmas, hierarchies, and manuals of conduct, African spirituality, the true one, is not born from the fear of hell, but from the celebration of life and communion with the invisible. Ancient black civilizations, and here we speak of the peoples of Kemet, Kush, the Yoruba, Bantu, Akan, and many others, had a worldview deeply connected to the whole. There was no separation between the spiritual and the material, between body and soul, between human and nature. Everything was part of the same sacred organism. They saw God not as an old man seated on a throne in the sky, distant, angry, and punishing. They saw God as a living presence in all things. The river was sacred, the mountain was an altar, the wind carried messages, and the earth was the nurturing mother. God was in the elements, in silence, in cycles, in the memory of those who came before. This black spiritual matrix is centered on three fundamental pillars: ancestor worship, reverence for nature, and direct experience with the divine. This means that the people didn't need a stone temple to encounter the sacred. The temple was the body. It was the heart at peace. It was the beaten ground, the echoing drum, the circle dance, the purifying water. Spirituality was lived, not just taught. It was felt, sung, and danced. And just look how powerful. This vision excluded no one. Men, women, children, everyone participated in the rituals. Wisdom was shared, not monopolized. The eldest had a voice, the youngest had value. There were priestesses, healers, shamans, elders, all in balance, serving the community with their spiritual gifts. None of this was separate from everyday life. Black spirituality was present in the preparation of food, in the birth of a child, in the passing of a loved one. Now tell me, does this resemble what you were taught in conventional religions? Most of the time, no. Because Western religions were shaped within a system of power, rules, and submission. God was transformed into a judge. The temple became an institution. Contact with the spiritual became dependent on a leader, a formal ritual and permission. But the black spiritual matrix has always taught, you don't need anyone between you and the sacred. Your intuition is the channel. Your body is the altar. Your ancestry is the link. And here lies the great rupture between black spiritual visions and the European religious structure. While the West promoted guilt, sin, punishment, and fear, black ancestry promoted healing, balance, harmony, and reconnection with essence. This doesn't mean there was no order or ethics. Quite the contrary, African spiritual laws were profound, but they were grounded in care for the community, respect for elders, love of nature, and recognition of the spirit that dwells in all things. Do you understand the beauty of this? This black spiritual matrix understands that the soul does not walk alone. It carries within itself those who came before and prepares the way for those who will come after. Ancestry is not just memory. It is an active presence. Ancestors are honored not as gods, but as spiritual guardians. They are guides, advisors, voices that echo through time. This is not demonic invocation, as many have said to defame this tradition. It is honor. It is gratitude. It is recognition. When someone connects with this root, they're not surrendering to folklore. They're reconnecting with a legitimate spiritual lineage that was forcibly interrupted by slavery, by catechism, by colonization. But even with all this, it resisted. It survived. It passed down through generations in the form of chants, whispered prayers, stories told by the fire. This spirituality hasn't died because it lives in the blood, in the drum, in the language of the soul. But it's also important to understand that this matrix isn't just African in the geographical sense. It's African in the sense of origin. It's in the spiritual DNA of millions of people around the world who today follow institutionalized religions but feel a void, a disconnection, a restlessness. And often this restlessness is the spirit's call to return to the source, back to the root, back to the essence, return to what was deleted. And this doesn't mean abandoning everything you've learned, but reviewing, questioning, and diving deeper, because there is no true faith without freedom of conscience. And how can you have freedom if you've never heard the other side of the story? How can you position yourself spiritually if you've only been taught one part of the truth and hidden the other? Ancestral black spirituality does not compete with others. It does not try to convince. It does not impose. It invites. It welcomes. It heals. It awakens. This is why many who have strayed from faith because they did not feel represented in traditional models are now returning through African traditions, religions of African origin, and spiritual philosophies that respect the body, soul, time, and the natural cycle of life. And here I want to leave you with a thought. Could it be that the discomfort you feel when you hear about black religions, wasn't it planted by someone who didn't want you to know this truth? Could it be that your soul is asking for a reconnection with something your ancestors knew deeply? Could it be that the guilt and fear you were taught were actually control mechanisms? Now that you know how this black spiritual worldview worked, a way of seeing the world where everything is connected, where God is not far away, but within you, tell me, do you feel this vision makes sense? Comment below, my soul recognizes the root. Or else, I want to reconnect with my ancestors. Now that you understand the depth of ancestral black spirituality, the next question is inevitable. If all of this was so true, so alive, so connected to the divine, why did they hide it? Who decided it all needed to be erased? And most importantly, what did they gain from it? The answer, though painful, is clear. The concealment of these religions was no accident. It was a strategy. It was deliberate. From the earliest contact between European empires and African civilizations, it was clear that black people were not only physically strong, but also spiritually profound, culturally rich and intellectually sophisticated. And this was frightening. African spirituality was not fragile or primitive as some tried to portray. It was powerful, liberating, and autonomous. And for an empire that sought to conquer, enslave, and dominate, a spiritually free people was a problem. Then, the invisible war began. Not a war of weapons, yet, but a war of meanings, symbols, and interpretations. The colonizers needed to make Africans disbelieve in their own faith, and the first step was to demonize everything that differed from European religion. African gods came to be called demons. Rituals, witchcraft, drums, invocations of evil, priests, witches. Everything that wasn't part of European theology came to be treated as the work of the devil. But why? Because by weakening spirituality, they weakened resistance. Taking away a people's spiritual connection is like cutting their roots. Without identity, without belonging, without ties to their ancestors, the people become easier to subjugate. And that's what happened. Physical slavery was accompanied by spiritual slavery, and this was the most effective because it was invisible. The missionaries arrived with the cross, but they didn't arrive in peace. They arrived with the talk of saving souls, but what they did in practice was nullify entire cultures. They destroyed sacred temples, burned objects of power, banned languages, and forced people to accept a new faith that placed them as inferior. Imagine being born with a living faith in your heart and suddenly being forced to believe that this faith is evil, simply because the oppressor decided so. And here's the point no one wants to talk about. This spiritual substitution was institutionalized. It wasn't just the action of individual colonizers. It was endorsed, structured, and organized by empires and churches. The institutionalized church played a central role in this concealment. It not only supported slavery, but also theologically justified the spiritual inferiority of black people. And this racist theology was passed down from generation to generation, as if it were biblical truth. But now I ask you, how can the Bible, which speaks of justice, equality, and love, have been used to justify the erasure of such authentic spirituality? The answer is stark. The Bible was manipulated, not the original text, but the way it was interpreted, translated, and taught. Many passages that exalt African peoples were ignored, others were distorted, and most shockingly, entire books were removed from the Bible precisely because they contradicted the narrative the system wanted to maintain. These books, now called apocrypha or forbidden, carried powerful messages. Some revealed the direct relationship between the prophets and the African people. Others contained spiritual wisdom closer to ancestral black tradition than to Western theology, but they were banned, burned, and hidden. The question is, why? The answer lies in the threat. Because if these books were read, if these messages were understood, the empire would lose control. Black spirituality would flourish again. The truth would come to light. And with it, the ideological dominance that sustained the system would end. Furthermore, many of these historical documents, letters, accounts, ancient writings, were simply erased from the records. Others, when they could not be destroyed, were locked away in secret archives, in restricted libraries of the church itself, under the pretext of protecting the faith of the faithful. But protect from what? Protecting them from knowing that Jesus was welcomed by Egyptians, that the Queen of Sheba was African and taught wisdom to King Solomon, that many of the biblical characters had dark skin, came from regions of the African continent, and carried with them a spirituality much more similar to ancestral black practices than to the religion of the colonizers. This information has been systematically silenced, but the spirit cannot be silenced. The truth cannot be stifled forever, and that's why you're here now, watching this video, feeling something inside you make sense. It's as if your soul is recognizing an ancient truth, a truth that has always been there, but that you were taught to fear. And it's not about confronting faith with faith, it's about looking at history with clear eyes, with courage, with depth. It's about asking, why was I taught that faith is only legitimate if it comes from outside? Why was I taught that everything with African traits is dangerous? Why was I taught that the divine can only be accessed through a structure that distances me from my origins? This concealment was a strategy to keep black people on their knees, not in prayer, but in submission. And now it's time to rise up, to raise our minds, to raise our consciousness, to raise our spirits. If this part of the video touched you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever suspected that parts of the Bible and history were hidden to distance you from your origins? Have you ever felt like there was more to what you were taught in church? Comment here, the truth is coming back. Or, if you want to make a stronger statement, write, I no longer accept a manipulated faith. You may have heard that the Bible is a European book, that everything sacred there was born under the influence of Jewish, Greek, or Roman culture. But what few have the courage to say, or even know, is that the Bible is, in large part, an African book. That's right, and not just by geography, but by presence, protagonism, and spiritual symbolism. When you begin to see the scriptures through decolonized eyes, the truth begins to leap from the pages. A truth that was there all along, but was ignored, erased, or diminished. Think about it. Ethiopia, for example, is mentioned numerous times throughout Scripture. In Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Zephaniah, and the Psalms alone, you'll find the name Cush or Ethiopia, depending on the translation. And these aren't random mentions. These are passages that portray Ethiopia as a blessed land, a spiritual reference, a people present in God's plans. In Psalm 68:31, it is written, Princes will come out of Egypt. Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God. Stop and consider the weight of this phrase. Ethiopia will stretch out her hands to God. This is not a metaphor. This is spiritual recognition. It is prophecy. But even with this verse so clear, why were we taught to see Africa only as the cursed continent? Why was it that when they spoke about the descendants of Ham, Noah's son, they automatically associated it with a curse, slavery, and inferiority? This doctrine has been taught for centuries, but it's not in the Bible. It's in the racist interpretation of those who use the Bible as an instrument of oppression. Ham wasn't cursed. The curse was upon Canaan. And yet they took this text and distorted it to the point of justifying an entire structure of slavery and cultural erasure. Now, let's remember another very important point. Egypt, one of the most frequently mentioned countries in Scripture. Egypt is a vital part of the biblical narrative. And have you ever noticed that at key moments in the lives of the main biblical characters, Egypt is present? Abraham went to Egypt. Joseph was sold into slavery and became governor in Egypt. Moses was born in Egypt, and Jesus was protected in Egypt. It seems no one pays attention to the fact that God's own son was taken to Africa to be saved. While Herod ordered the boys killed in Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph were ordered to flee to Egypt. The question they never ask is, why was Egypt chosen? Why did the Messiah have to be hidden there? Now take a deep breath and reflect. Egypt was no ordinary country. It was the center of ancient spiritual and esoteric knowledge. It was the land of ancient wisdom. It was dark, it was powerful, and that's where Jesus hid. Coincidence? Or is there a hidden symbol in all this? Isn't there an even deeper spiritual message in this movement? The child God did not flee to Europe. He was not protected by Greeks, Romans, or Persians. He was welcomed into the spiritual womb of Africa, in the heart of the land where divine knowledge had already dwelt for millennia. And if we look at this with the right eyes, we realize that the salvation of Jesus' life passes through the African continent, a divine gesture of reconnection with one's roots, a silent recognition of black wisdom. And this isn't the only time we see this bond. The Queen of Sheba, who came to visit King Solomon, was African. A wise, wealthy, and powerful woman, she tested Solomon with difficult questions and left amazed by his wisdom. Many scholars believe that this union gave rise to a spiritual lineage that influenced the Ethiopian dynasty itself. And did you know that to this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves traditions so ancient that many scholars consider them closer to the original Christian faith than Western traditions? That's right. In Ethiopia, there is a Christian tradition that survived European colonization. It preserves ancient spiritual practices such as fasting, veneration of the Old Testament prophets, and the presence of sacred texts that were never accepted into the European canon. Among these texts is the famous Book of Enoch, which speaks of fallen angels, celestial knowledge, and profound spiritual revelations, and which was rejected by the council that defined the current Bible, but is considered sacred in Ethiopia. Now, do you see how everything is connected? The African characters in the Bible are not extras. They are central to the story of salvation. And yet, we were taught that all of this was detail. We were led to believe that Africa was merely a backdrop, when, in fact, it was part of the plan. This connection to the Bible is more than symbolic. It's proof that black spirituality has never been separated from divine revelation. It was humankind, out of self-interest, who separated it, who reshaped the narrative, who removed, mistranslated, ignored, and ultimately silenced. But the Spirit is not silent. It blows where it wills. And now it is blowing upon you, awakening you to something you may never have heard, but which your soul seems to already know. How many times have you heard sermons about Rome, Jerusalem, the Apostle Paul, the letters of the New Testament, but never heard a sermon about Ethiopia, Cush, or spiritual Egypt? How many times have you been told about the churches of Asia Minor, but never shown that African wisdom was present from Genesis to Revelation? This is not an innocent omission. It's part of the structure that has hidden black religion. A spirituality that needs no mediation, that recognizes the cycles of life, that reveres ancestors, that sees the presence of God in everything, including your skin, your hair, your body, your story. And when you understand this connection to the Bible, you begin to realize that your faith doesn't need to be imported. It can be reconnected. It can be strengthened by its roots. You can look at the scriptures with new eyes, with the eyes of liberation, with the eyes of someone who knows that black spirituality is not a recent invention. It is a truth that predates colonization. If you are feeling this calling, I want to hear from you. Comment below, "I acknowledge my presence in the Bible." Or if you prefer, write it out loud, "Africa is in the divine plan." Now that you begin to understand the profound connection between black spirituality and scripture, it's impossible not to wonder, why has this never been spoken about in churches? Why has this truth, so evident, so present in biblical texts, in ancestral spiritual traditions, in the roots of faith, been hidden? And here we enter a delicate but absolutely necessary point. Because for many people, the church represents absolute truth. But what few know, and almost no one dares to say, is that many of the doctrines taught from today's pulpits were created, adapted, or manipulated to serve political, economic, and racial interests. That's right. What you hear on Sundays is often not the original faith, but an adapted, whitewashed, pasteurized, and colonized faith. And when I say the church didn't tell you certain things, I'm not saying all pastors act in bad faith. Many don't even know it. They repeat what they learned in seminary, which in turn follows a theological tradition based on the European worldview, not the spiritual origins of Scripture. And this is where we need to stop everything and take a deep breath, because what I'm about to show you now may shake much of what you believe to be true, but at the same time, it can set you free. Let's start with something that seems simple but carries an absurd symbolic weight. The color black has been associated with evil. But why? Why did black come to signify darkness, sin, curse, devil, danger? Why is heaven white and hell dark? Why are angels blonde and devils black? This construct didn't come from the Bible. It stemmed from the racist European mentality that associated skin color with the idea of purity or evil. And the church, unfortunately, incorporated this without question. In Scripture, skin color was never used as a sign of sin. Never. But European theologians reinterpreted passages, manipulated words, and created an unconscious association between blackness and sin. And this was profoundly violent, because it affected not only the image of God, but the self-image of millions of black people throughout history. How many black children grew up believing they had to cleanse themselves spiritually, as if they were naturally tainted? How many learned to see themselves as the cursed people of Ham? How many were taught that their culture was demonic, that their drum was of the devil, that their rhythm, their dance, their body, their history were dangerous to their faith? All of this was constructed with great care as a true project, a plan for disconnection. And here we come to another even more serious point. African rituals and symbols were demonized. What was once seen as a connection to the sacred came to be interpreted as witchcraft, incense, dance, embodiment, praise in the form of ancestral chants, contact with spirits. All of this was rejected by churches as pagan practices. But ironically, many of these same practices were reintroduced into European and Christian churches under different names. Praying in tongues. It already existed in ancient African traditions. Fasting and spiritual baths, a common practice among the Bantu and Yoruba peoples. Praise with percussion instruments. It has always been the basis of Afro descendant worship. Laying on hands, anointing with oil, using natural elements like water, salt, and herbs. All practices originate from black spirituality. But in Western churches, when performed with institutional authorization, they are considered sacred. When performed in their original African context, they are called Makamba work, hypocrisy or fear of the truth. And have you noticed that even Catholic saints, in an attempt to erase African deities, were substituted? Ogum became Saint George. Yemanja became Our Lady. Zango became Saint Jerome. This wasn't spontaneous syncretism. It was a form of spiritual survival in the face of persecution. Enslaved people, prevented from worshipping their orishas, adapted their rituals so that their ancestral faith would remain alive under the watchful eye of their masters. And yet, the church continued to say that all of this was demonic, not because it was evil, but because it was black, free, and powerful. And here we need to address another wound. Doctrines were replaced or reinterpreted to distance people from the truth. The doctrine of salvation, for example, became centered on the idea of guilt, original sin, and unworthiness. But this was not Jesus' central message. The message was one of reconciliation with the divine, of healing, of liberation. But this was stifled by dogmas, councils, rules, and fears. You were taught that you needed an authorized mediator to speak to God, that without the blessing of a pastor, priest, or institution, your faith was worthless, and little by little, faith ceased to be spiritual and became institutional. But black spirituality never needed marble temples. The body, the spirit, nature, and the word were always enough. And perhaps that's why it was so opposed, because it taught that you are sacred by nature, that you don't need permission to connect with God, that your story is divine. And when this consciousness awakens, when people begin to remember when ancestral truth begins to return, the system trembles. Because Black spirituality is not passive. It is active, it questions, it moves, it transforms. And the institutionalized church often doesn't want transformation. It wants maintenance, it wants control, it wants predictability. And the Spirit, well, the Spirit blows where it wills. And right now it is blowing upon you. If you're here now listening to all this, it's because you can no longer pretend you don't know. The seed has been planted. The truth has been revealed. The question now is, what will you do with it? If what you heard touched you in any way, write here in the comments. I no longer accept a faith that denies my roots. Or if you want to express it more intensely, say, my spirituality is sacred and ancestral. Leave your comment. It helps spread this message. It shows YouTube that this content is relevant. Even after centuries of persecution, attempts at erasure, public demonization, and systematic bans, Black spirituality has survived. And it didn't survive by chance. It survived because it carries within itself something stronger than any oppression, the power of ancestry. It survived because it didn't depend on books, temples, or official permission. It was kept alive orally, in bodies, in gestures, in shared memory, passed down from generation to generation, like a flame that never goes out, even when suffocated. While the colonizers imposed the cross with one hand and the whip with the other, our ancestors were on their knees not to the oppressors, but to the orishas, voduns, and incases. Spiritual entities that were always present, even beneath the chains. When they banned sacred chants in African languages, the chants became whispers. When they burned the symbols, the meanings were hidden within other symbols. When they banned rituals, they were reinvented, reinterpreted, and masked under the language of Catholicism, but they remained alive. This is the root of syncretism. But syncretism here isn't a weak mixture, it's strategic resistance. It was the way to keep the sacred alive even under surveillance. That's why to this day we see in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and so many other places, religions of African origin that bear on the outside the names of Catholic saints, but on the inside the powerful archetypes of African deities. Ogum transformed into Saint George. Yemanja became Our Lady of Navigators. Zango disguised himself as Saint Jerome. But the essence remains. And here, perhaps, lies one of the greatest revelations. These religions that survived slavery, colonization, and cultural extermination carry within them the soul of early Christianity. That's right. Before the Crusades, before European theology, before the councils that defined dogmas, Christianity was a living, organic, communal faith, connected to practice, to the body, to the spirit, to the invisible. And much of what these Black religions maintain today has more connection to this original Christianity than to later institutionalized Christianity. Note the elements. The idea of spiritual embodiment present in Umbanda, Candomblé, Vodun, and Santeria reflects what is described in the New Testament as a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. Spiritual gifts, trances, revelations, inspired songs, all of these were common in early Christian communities, but today are seen as strange, exotic, or even diabolical. Why? Because spiritual colonization has made it seem as if everything that doesn't follow the European standard is evil. But the root, the essence, is alive, still pulsating in Black practices, and the force that sustained all of this was ancestry. Because in the Black world, ancestors aren't dead, they're present. They aren't past, they're guidance. And this ancestral presence manifests itself in the words of elders, in the advice of holy mothers, in the gestures of holy fathers, in the beating of the atabaque drum, in the smell of sacred food, in the dance that spins and connects heaven to earth. It's a faith that has a body, a sound, a color, a roots. And even with everything that has been done to destroy this connection, even with the persecutions, the bonfires of the Inquisition, the current attacks of religious intolerance, black spirituality remains steadfast, not because resistance is an option, but because resistance is a legacy, and this legacy was left by those who bled, by those who were beaten, by those who died whispering the name of their Orisha while being forced to pray the Lord's Prayer. But look how powerful this is. Even when institutional religion told them they were cursed servants, that they had to be forcibly converted, that their beliefs were demonic, they kept the spark of their original faith alive. Not out of vanity, not out of stubbornness, but because they knew deep in their souls that what they carried came from long before and would go much further. Orality was the temple, memory was the book, the body was the altar. And today, when someone enters an Umbanda terreiro, steps into a candomblé hut, participates in a drum circle or a santeria ritual, they are entering a space where what was erased by colonization still shines. Perhaps not with the same name, perhaps not with the same gestures, but with the same essence, with the same strength, with the same truth. And so these religions can no longer be viewed as folklore, as mixtures, as macumba, in the pejorative sense many insist on using. What lies there is an ancestral theology that has survived humanity's worst moments, a theology that speaks of life, death, healing, justice, ancestry, and connection with the divine. And that was built by black hands, black hearts, and black souls. And that today invites everyone, including the sons and daughters of the diaspora, to return home, not physically, but spiritually. Can you see how strong this is? How many of us were taught to fear all this? How many grew up believing that only what was white, calm, starched, and formal was sacred? How many were taught to kneel before a European altar, but never before their own mirror, recognizing in their face, their color, their features, the image and likeness of God? For this surviving faith is calling you. It doesn't want to destroy your current belief. It wants to expand. It wants to heal. It wants to remember. Because spirituality isn't about division. It's about reconnection. It's about reunion. And rediscovering the faith of your ancestors is reconnecting with parts of yourself that were ripped away, but now want to return. And maybe everything you're feeling right now, this restlessness, this excitement, this curiosity, is your spirit recognizing what has been forgotten. If you've made it this far, I want to know what it did to you. Comment here. The faith of my ancestors lives in me. Or else, I recognize the religion that survived. Write your thoughts in the comments. This reinforces this message and shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people. Now that you begin to recognize that black spirituality not only survived, but resisted with dignity and depth, it's time to confront one of the greatest mechanisms behind erasure. The transformation of spiritual knowledge into a tool of social control. Because what was once knowledge to liberate became a structure to dominate. What was wisdom to heal became a doctrine to subjugate. Spirituality, which should be a channel for reconnecting with the divine, was distorted to become a fence, a prison. And this was no accident. Imagine a people who know the sky through the stars, who understand time through the moon, who feel the presence of the divine in plants, in cycles, in water, in fire. A people who know who they are because they know where they came from, who honor their dead and celebrate life with the same respect. These people are not easy to control because they already carry within themselves a sense of spiritual identity. They don't depend on another to speak to God. They already know, they already hear, they already feel. And that is why, historically, every empire that sought to dominate a people first tried to take control of their spirituality. The phrase you need to remember is, whoever controls the sacred controls the people. And that's what happened in every phase of colonization. Spiritual knowledge, which was free, circulating, oral, intuitive, was captured, labeled, and shelved within institutions. They created closed theologies, rigid dogmas, and unique and indisputable interpretations. And anyone who dared to think differently was considered heresy. It was disobedience. It was rebellion. But is faith really blind obedience? Or does true faith arise from conscience, because that's where the secret lies? African spirituality, for example, was never about following rules imposed by a hierarchical elite. It was about connection, about experience, about reciprocity. And this knowledge was repressed. They took the wisdom of herbs and called it witchcraft. They took the wisdom of the body and called it lust. They took the wisdom of the spirit and called it demonic possession. They took what was liberating and declared it dangerous, and at the same time they instituted a theology where only a few have access to the sacred, an authorized clergy, a closed language, a text translated, edited, and cut, and presented as the only path to God. If you don't follow, you're lost. If you don't agree, you're in sin. If you question, you're in rebellion. But the question that remains is, why is there such a need for control over faith? Simple. Because controlling spirituality is controlling the mind. And controlling the mind is dominating the body. When a people believe their suffering is divine punishment, they don't resist. When they believe their color is a curse, they hide. When they believe their drum is the devil's, they remain silent. And when they believe there is only salvation within an authorized structure, they kneel, not by choice, but out of fear. And fear, my brother, my sister, is the greatest instrument of control that ever existed, because fear paralyzes. Fear makes you stupid. Fear makes you accept what hurts you as if it were a blessing. And that's how so many people remain trapped in a faith that humiliates them, that denies them, that doesn't represent them. But they remain there for fear of hell, for fear of rejection, for fear of making mistakes. And it all began when knowledge was separated from experience. When spirituality ceased to be lived and taught only by those with a title. When a wall was placed between the sacred and the people. And from then on, everything became rules, prohibitions, and guilt, and the flame of direct connection with the divine was extinguished. But it only seemed extinguished because it remained lit in many hearts. It remained a light in the black woman who prays silently in the early hours, invoking the strength of her ancestors. In the young man who enters the temple but leaves uneasy, feeling something is missing. In the woman who cooks with faith, with wisdom, transforming food into prayer. In the man who looks to the sky and knows, without anyone needing to tell him, that God is closer than they taught. This flame is within you, it's there, in that uneasiness that may be growing as you hear these words. Because something inside you knows that what they told you isn't everything. That what they hid has to do with your history. That what they erased has to do with your strength. And now that you're seeing all this, the question is, how can you reclaim this original spirituality? The answer isn't outside. It's not in a new temple, a new leader, a new religion. It begins within. It begins when you decide to remember, when you seek the root, when you begin to listen to your elders, to read with clear eyes, to feel with an open heart. Original spirituality isn't about ritual. It's about awareness. It's about returning to a state of listening, of reverence, of presence. It is possible to recover what has been distorted, but not by copying the past, but by honoring what remains alive. It's not about abandoning everything you've experienced so far. It's about looking with more truth, more courage, more depth. Understanding that faith doesn't have to be small to fit a mold. It can be large, ancestral, colorful, sonorous, feminine, masculine, collective, alive. Yes, you can attend a service and at the same time understand the strength of your ancestors. Yes, you can read the Bible and perceive the layers of spirituality that have been silenced. Yes, you can have a Christian faith connected to your blackness, your history, your body. And that is not a sin. That is healing. That is remembrance. That is liberation. Because what was taken from us can be reclaimed. And this reclaiming begins with awareness. It begins with recognizing that for centuries, spirituality was used as a weapon, but that now it can once again be a bridge. If this content touched your heart, and you are understanding the depth of this awakening, comment below. I choose to reclaim my spirituality. Or if you feel like you need to go even deeper, write, ancestral knowledge lives within me. Write your thoughts in the comments. This helps the channel grow and shows me that this message is reaching the right hearts. There comes a point in this journey when the penny truly drops, not just as a nagging suspicion, but as a cry echoing inside. What if everything I was taught about faith was shaped by self-interest, not truth? This is a difficult question to face, because it affects not only what you believe, but the very foundation of your spiritual identity. It's as if you suddenly look back and realize that many of the certainties that seemed solid were actually based on structures of control, fear, and omission. And the scariest thing, all of this was taught under the guise of holiness. It's not easy to admit, but perhaps you've been deceived, not directly like someone telling a blatant lie, but in a more subtle, dangerous, and structural way, a carefully edited, controlled, whitened, westernized faith, and presented as unique. And behind this, a strategy to erase black spirituality, marginalize ancestral practices, and replace it with a theology that serves power more than truth. You were taught to distrust what is yours, to find strange what comes from your own roots, to look with disdain on the rituals of your ancestors. You were taught that Macumba was the work of the devil, but they never explained that this word was used by the colonizers to ridicule any form of spirituality that didn't fit their mold. You were taught to sing translated praises, but they didn't let you hear the drums that echoed even before the arrival of the caravels. You were conditioned to see black as negative, the ancestor as superstition, and the body as the enemy of the soul. But none of this is actually found in the sacred texts. What's in the Bible, when read with decolonized eyes, is a different story. It's the story of a people who resisted, of a land that was the stage for great revelations, of black characters who walked with God, of a living, organic, profound spirituality, one that doesn't need imperial authorization to be sacred. But why was this version of faith hidden from you? Because conscious faith is dangerous. A person who understands their ancestral spirituality doesn't bow down so easily. They question, they think, they feel, and a faith based on direct experience with the sacred cannot be easily tamed. That's why they created a system where only a few have the power of interpretation, where only one can speak and the others must listen in silence, where the pulpit is more important than the body, where salvation has become a bargaining chip, where guilt has become a tool, and where you have been reduced to a servant when in fact you were born with the divine spark within you. Spiritual truth was systematically hidden, and I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about a real historical process. Books were removed from the Bible, characters were whitewashed in images, symbols were changed, terms were reconfigured. Even the image of Jesus was altered. The historical Christ, born in a region of Afro-Asian admixture, with dark skin and Semitic features, was transformed into the blonde, blue-eyed icon we see in paintings. This isn't just an aesthetic issue, it's a silent message. It's an unconscious message. The sacred doesn't look like you, but the truth is returning. And it's not coming from outside, it's awakening within you, because when you begin to allow yourself to question and not just repeat, you begin to realize the holes in the official narrative. You begin to remember, even without having lived it. You begin to hear ancient echoes. You begin to sense there's something more. and that something more is the call of your ancestral spirit. It's the one whispering, "You've been deceived, but there's still time to remember." It's painful, yes. It's frustrating to realize that much of what you believe to be absolute was built on the silencing of your own people. But at the same time, it's liberating, because now you can rebuild, not based on guilt, but on awareness, not based on fear, but on truth. Now you can walk in faith, but a faith with roots. And what comes next, if you have the courage to continue, is an even deeper dive. Because seeking beyond what you've been taught requires willingness. It requires humility. It requires breaking molds, and that's not always accepted. Many will call you a rebel, a deviant, dangerous. But let me tell you a secret. Jesus was also called that. He broke with the religious structure of his time. He questioned the teachers of the law. He sat with the outcast. And he brought a spirituality that liberated, not imprisoned. You are walking the same path. Perhaps you're still wondering, was it all a lie? And the answer isn't simple. Not everything was a lie, but much truth was hidden, and what was told by those interested in controlling. Now is the time to listen to other voices, to hear the silenced, to rescue the knowledge that was stored in the folds of time, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And perhaps that moment is now. Perhaps you are the missing link in this chain of reconnection. Perhaps you were deceived, yes, but you don't have to remain deceived. If this reflection touched something within you, leave a comment below. I choose to see beyond what I was taught. Or, if you felt this internal confrontation, write with force. I was deceived, but now I see. Write with sincerity. Your comment helps reinforce this message and shows that there is a thirst for truth. If you've come this far, it's because something within you is awakening, and this is no accident. It's your spirit recognizing a truth that has always been there, but for too long has been silenced. And if this video spoke to you, it's time to take the next step on this journey. Subscribe to the channel now. Don't delay. Here you'll find content that honors your history, your faith, and your ancestry. Comment below. The truth has set me free. This phrase will show that you stayed until the end and are ready to continue this spiritual reconnection with awareness and courage.